So today we still kick off and continue into part 2 of our sermon series about the parables. Now the parables, they can be extremely hard to understand. They can be extremely hard to read. And there are some very tough truths when you really get into the thick of parables. Remember I told you guys last week when we started talking about parables that I believe that they are an eye exam for the soul. They are an eye exam for the soul, that every single one of us, that when Jesus is telling these parables, we need to look at these parables and look at the mirror of what's reflected back and see if it mirrors what he's saying or if it looks nothing like it. And if it looks nothing like it, then we need to readjust what it is that we see in the mirror. Today, we're going to be looking at one that's a very popular parable, and probably one that you've read several times, and we're going to break it down and we're going to look at this, okay? So if you have your Bibles, I would love for you to turn to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, and we're going to be looking at verses 25 through 37. Verses 25 through 37 in Luke chapter 10. And I'll wait a little bit because I hear some pages flipping and turning. But for the most part, again, just so those of you that may have forgotten already, Luke 10, 25 through 37. And for those of you that may not have a Bible, no big deal. We will have the verses on the screens up there. So here is Jesus with some people. And he's in this situation, much like we talked about last week, to where wherever he would go, there would seem to be some sort of discrepancy about what he was doing. There would always be some religious elite individuals who were always trying to challenge Jesus on what he was doing, or even worse yet, who he was around or who he was hanging out with. And this is no different. So here is Jesus. He's in this setting, and here's what happens. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. And it's actually a really good question. It's probably one that has actually been the start of our journey. Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? What do I have to do to get to heaven, Jesus? What do I have to do to receive this eternal life? Because it's a huge one. Because we all understand that death is something that every single one of us is going to taste at one time. You will not escape this life without experiencing death. And there's all kind of questions about it. There's all kind of concerns about it. But the reality of it is, no matter how healthy you are, how healthy you eat, no matter what you do, there's going to be a day to where you breathe your last breath. And scary thing is, there's nothing that anybody can help with it. There's nothing that you can do. It is going to come to us all. So you could understand why this expert in religious law is asking this question. And did you notice that what it said? I mean, you always know it's going to be a great time when he says he's an expert in religious law. And did you notice that it says that he stood up? Now, during these times, whenever you had a rabbi around, it was actually a show of dishonor to stand up in his presence. Usually it was him that was standing and the students would sit down. And in this case, the expert in religious law stands up, and you see in the Bible, it tells us that he stood up, not to say, hey, he stood up to what? To test Jesus. Now, can I tell you something? Just through every single way that I've seen and every single story that I've seen, it's not a good idea to test Jesus, right? He always comes away making you look like you're an idiot. So just a little FYI, never test Jesus. Come on, right? He stands up to test Jesus, and he asks him, teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And in 26 it says this, that Jesus replied, well, what does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? And I love that. He essentially asks him another question. He doesn't answer it for him. He actually asks him a question, because that's what a good teacher does. A good teacher doesn't always answer and spoon feed you everything, because he understands that when he spoon feeds you, you've done no effort to find the truth yourself. And so he says, well, what does the law of Moses say, especially if he is an expert in religious law? What does the law of Moses say? And not only that, not just what it says, because here's the reality. We understand that you can read something and know what it says. Doesn't necessarily mean that you understand what it says. And he says, what does the law of Moses says? And then probably the best question that he could ask him is, how do you read it? Isn't that crazy? How do you read it? Like, think about this, the things that Jesus said we talked about last week. Turn the other cheek. How do you read that? Or how about this one? Do good to those who persecute you. How do you read that? Or how about this one? Go the extra mile. Man, the first mile's tough enough. To go an extra mile, how do you read that? So he wants to get to the heart of the matter. Here's the reality. How do you read Jesus here today? How do you read Jesus when the message is given? How do you read Jesus when you sit down and read it just word for word? How do you read it? And the man answered, oh, this is easy. You know, he's standing up, he's challenging Jesus, he's testing Jesus. Jesus asks him a question back, and here's what he says. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. And then he said, and love your neighbor as yourself. Essentially what he's quoting is the Shema. It is something that in the morning and the evenings was read all the time, and every single Jewish individual would have understood the Shema like this. They would have understood that it is the basis of everything that the law is about, right? They would have understood that it hinges on this. Jesus even said it, that the law and the prophets, it hinges on these understandings. Essentially, the entire law is summed up with those ideas from Genesis all the way to Malachi. We see these realities played out in there, that to love the Lord, the God, with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. And then the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And then the question becomes, how do I know when I'm actually loving God like that? You know what I find in our own lives? Is that every single one of us, if I was to ask, how many of you love God? You know what would probably happen? Every single hand would go up. You would all say, absolutely, I think about God all the time. You know, absolutely, I love God. I'm here today. I'm showing you that I love God. I pray. I give tithes. You know what I mean? Like when worship was going on, like I may not know the songs, but I raised my hand and I made up words. You know, I just made them up. It's still to Jesus. You know, I show you that I love God. I post it on Facebook every day. Whenever the chain emails come, I send them to everybody I know. Because I love Jesus, right? But here's the question. And maybe not the question yet, but here's the thing that we all know. It's all easy for us to come in here and say we love God. You know how you really know how well you love God? Is the second part of it. How well you love your neighbor. You know what Jesus tells him after he says this? Jesus replied in 26, or actually in 28, right, Jesus said to him, do this and you will live. It's simple. Right? If it's that simple, do this and live. Just, if you follow that, hey, you'll be good. Jesus, not really trying to push it, not really trying to get in. This guy is still standing. And it seems like at this point you would understand, like there's tension in the room. Jesus is standing, and here's this expert in religious law. He's standing too, and they're probably looking at each other eye to eye. You could kind of see Jesus not being hostile at all, just asking questions. And this guy thinks he's done something, right? And 29, the guy can't just leave it alone. You see what it says? The man wanted to justify his actions. Aren't we all there sometimes, trying to justify our actions? I need to justify why it is that I'm challenging you, Jesus. I need to justify really what I'm trying to get to. I need to justify this. And like I said before, it's very dangerous territory to try to challenge Jesus and justify your actions before him. But he's going to try it. And I really can't say any different I've tried it too. I mean, many of us are here today, and we're going to get into the meat of this. And I find something interesting. Whenever we get to that whole neighbor thing, I find myself looking just like the expert in religious law. Neighbor. I mean, it's easy to love the neighbor that's good to me. Right? It's easy to love the one that treats me really well. It's a lot harder to treat the one who calls the cops on me because of my dog. It's harder to treat the neighbor that treats you harshly sometimes or never speaks to you. It is hard to love everybody. And this expert in religious law, he understands that. The man, he wants to justify his actions for challenging Jesus. He wants to put Jesus on the ropes. And so he asks a question that's really good. Is I understand the idea about loving the Lord, the God, with all their heart. But Jesus, can I just ask you something? Who exactly is my neighbor? I mean, I understand, like that's great, but who's my neighbor, Jesus? And this is a good question. It's a good question because you have to understand the cultural content and context of the time. Why would this guy ask this question? Because there's a history of them being able to choose who their neighbor is. If you don't believe me, there are things to where in some of the intertestamental of books that we don't have in our Bible that were there at the time of Jesus, and you see them kind of talked about throughout the Bible. We see this stated, that place your bread on the grave of the righteous, but look at this, but give none to sinners. You see, for Jewish individuals, they would look at individuals that they would deem as sinners, that you don't give nothing to them. Or how about this one? In Sirach 12, 1 through 7, it says, it cautions that one should know to whom one is doing good. And in verses 4 through 5, it says, give to the devout, but do not help the sinner. Do good to the humble, but do not give to the ungodly. And it says this about the ungodly, hold back their bread and do not give it to them. In verse 7, it says this, give it to the one who is good, but do not help the sinner. So there are these ideas that you don't give anything. You've heard the old adage that eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This was the idea that even was around during this time too. So it's really important for you to tell me who my neighbor is, because I have whole books to where we destroyed our neighbor. Remember the Canaanites? Because Jesus, it's easy to say that, but what he's thinking is, my neighbor is another Jew. My neighbor is the guy that I love. So who's my neighbor, Jesus? Because I feel like I'm doing that, and if you say anything else, then you're going against the history and tradition of all of this. So what do we do, Jesus? Who is my neighbor? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? How do I do this, and who is my neighbor, Jesus? And so could you imagine it? The people going like, that's a really good question. You can almost see the hush going down, like, oh. See all the other students kind of sitting around. Can you imagine the disciples? Like, gee, that's a good question, Jesus. What are you going to say? And it seems like at some point, like Jesus is just sort of like standing there, and he launches into not just an outright assault of him. He could have made him look ridiculous by going through the Word of God and just showing him his shortcomings. Instead, he uses a parable. He uses a parable, and he comes in, and it says in 30, Jesus replied with a story. And here's his story. A Jewish man. You notice who's the one that's traveling? Who is it? You can say it. It's a Jewish man. Was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And he was attacked by bandits. And look at this. They stripped him of his clothes. They beat him and left him dead beside the road. The Jewish individual that was just traveling had literally been beaten so bad that they stripped him of his clothes, of his wealth and everything, and they literally left him by the road to die. Have you ever felt like life sometimes hits you like that? To where life has a way of knocking you down, beating you down, leaving you dead by the side of the road, stripping you of dignity, stripping you of who you are. And that is exactly what the Jews have gone through forever. And Jesus is telling them, listen, this man is in a really bad way right now. He has been left beside the road for dead. And he says in 31, and you would think like, so as the story goes, you go, well, what is happening? Like, okay, so what's going to happen, Jesus? And 31, he says, by chance, this priest came along, right? And he's telling you a story like a priest. Like that guy, he's certainly going to help out, right? The priest. Now, what you have to understand during this time is that the priests lived not too far. They pretty much lived where this area would happen and where this situation would happen in Jericho. You see, they stayed in Jericho because they could travel to do the temple worship and stuff like that. And they would stay there for 2 weeks. So it was very common knowledge during this time that the priest would be traveling this way. And Jesus is painting a picture of something that they would already be able to imagine because they see it every single day. What you may not also know is this, is during this time, the priests were some of the most influential and wealthy people of the time because of what they did. So the reason why they could do that, why they could stay there, is because they had enough money to not have to travel long distances. They stayed in Jericho because they could afford to do it and they could go there. But here's this priest that's coming, and all of the listeners and all of the hearers would basically be going like, oh yes, a priest is coming to save this Jewish man. But by chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, and I want you to highlight that saw, when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. Jesus, are you sure you like this story? I want you to think about this during this time. Priests were held to high esteem. Jews themselves were held to high esteem. They were God's chosen people. And he's telling a story about a Jewish individual that has been beat down. And he's also telling a story about a priest that sees a man in need. And when he sees him, he doesn't stop. He sees his condition and he walks to the other side of the road, and doesn't just walk to the other side of the road. He passes him by, leaving him broken, leaving him stripped, leaving him in this situation. The very individual that is called to be a representation of God to the people leaves him right where he is. God help us when the church looks the same way sometimes. That we are called to see the broken and the beaten down. We are called to lift them out of their brokenness, but yet we see them and we choose to walk on by, leaving them in the same condition. Don't you remember when you were in that situation? You couldn't get up by yourself. Life had beaten you down. My God, I thank God for a Jesus that sees me and doesn't walk by me. Walks to the other side and leaves this man to die. Can you imagine the hush over the crowd? Like, what? A priest? You're telling a story about a priest doing that? Now, have you ever read that and wondered, like, why would the priest do that? Any of you? Like, ever, as a religious individual ourselves, like, why would the priest do something like that? Well, it's actually not as crazy as you would think. You know why? And let me kind of help you see this. Many of the priests in the first century lived in Jericho, and this is what I was getting at. They would go to Jerusalem for a 2-week assignment and then return to their homes in Jericho. This priest that we see fits easily into such a pattern and may well have been on his way home from the sacred precincts of the temple after serving. So Jesus is painting a picture that they all see. Priests were actually hereditary guild and were known to be actually the wealthy class among Jewish people. Mannerheim Stern writes this. He says, towards the close of the Second Temple period, the priesthood constituted the prestigious and elite class in Jewish society. So right around this time, we are seeing this priesthood become sort of the elite class in Jewish society. Then as now various ethnic communities in the Middle East are actually identified by their clothes. That is how you could distinguish between who is the elite in class and who are not. They understood this, and it wasn't just that either. They understood and could be identified by their clothes, their language, or their accent. And in the first century, Jewish scholars, I want you to listen to this, Jewish scholars could speak Hebrew while the peasants spoke Aramaic, while the poor spoke Aramaic. And so government officials would have known Latin. I don't know if you knew that, but government officials during this time would have known Latin. So language, dress, and accent within these three ethnic classes and class markers, it was easy to distinguish for the Jewish individuals them versus us. They could distinguish between who they were and who we are. And so as they're coming in, he doesn't see this guy wearing clothes like a Jewish man would look like. You can understand, he's been probably beaten beyond recognition, so he probably can't even tell that he is a Jewish individual is the way that Jesus is bringing this out. He's been stripped of his clothes, so he can't tell if he's wearing the traditional Jewish wardrobe, or he can't probably even speak. Who knows if he hasn't been rendered unconscious because of the way that they've beaten him. And so Jesus is telling the story, and they understand what the priest is doing. The wounded man beside the road was unconscious and stripped. If the victim was a fellow Jew, and especially a law-abiding Jew, and we don't know that, the priest would have been responsible to reach out and help him if he knew he was. If he knew he was a Jew and that he was a good, rule-following Jew, he was obligated to stop and help him. But this victim, as he comes upon him, is naked and unconscious. So how could anyone be sure of his ethnic or even the way that he spoke? How could he know his identity? So the priest in Jesus' story is bound by something that's happening, by the religious law that's happening there. If the victim was a fellow Jew, and especially a law-abiding him, this priest had to help him. The wounded man could have been dead as well. So what I'm trying to show you is some of the things that the priest could have been dealing with. The wounded man could have been dead as well. So here's why that matters. If the priest who approached him would become ceremonial defiled, and if defiled, he would need to return to Jerusalem and undergo a week-long process of ceremonial purification. If this man happened to be dead and the priest stopped, he would in a sense be unclean himself, then have to go all the way back and wait a whole week to become pure again before he could do what he was going to do. So he knew that if he stopped and he didn't, and he really didn't have any indicators of what this was, it could stop him from doing what he felt God had called him to do. And what's more is the victim along the road might have been Egyptian. He might have been Greek or Syrian or Phoenician, in which case the priest was not responsible. I want you to listen to this. To which the priest was not responsible under the law if he would see him to do anything. So he would just bypass them. The only person that he would stop for is another Jew, the frozen chosen. If the priest approached the beaten man and touched him, and the man died later, the priest would have been obligated to rend his robes. And you see that throughout Scripture. He would have had to rend his robes, and in doing so would have violated laws against the destruction of valuable property. So what I'm trying to paint to you is why this Jewish priest would have bypassed. It's not because he was being stuck up. It's because he was trying to play the religious game that he had known and grown up with so well. He didn't want to become defiled. And so by doing so, he would leave a man broken, beaten, stripped, with no identity. I hope that by now you're seeing a story unfold. The poor priest did not have an easy time trying to determine his duty under the law. The whole way there, he was just trying to decide what to do, and he had all these reasons why he couldn't stop. After deciding that his ceremonial purity was too important to risk, he continued on his way. You see, because how he decided to handle this decision, if he stops or if he doesn't stop, especially if he stopped and became ceremonial impure, the decision was frightened with danger, you got to understand. If the priest became defiled and tried to serve at the altar in a state of uncleanliness, he could suffer the following fate that they tell us. It says this, that his brothers, this happened to another priest, that his brothers, the priests, did not bring him to the court, but the young men among the priests took him outside the temple court, and they beat him so bad that it split open his brain with clubs. That was the penalty that happened to other people that had done this, and you have to understand that he had been told this all of his life, so he's like, I don't want to be in that situation. So he leaves someone in need because he's afraid, and here's something crazy. He's afraid with how it'll affect him. Do you know the reason why most of us sometimes bypass people in great need is because we're afraid of how it'll affect us. How it'll affect us. And so we hear about this in 31, about a priest coming alongside, and then in 32 it says that a temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there. So here's this temple assistant that helped the priest, and he says that the priest, the temple assistant, he's walking by and he stops to take and observe the condition that the man is in. And you would think, well, maybe he's going to help him. He stops and looks at him. He sees his condition. It says he walked over and looked at him lying there, but he himself, after observing, after seeing the pain that he was in, after seeing exactly what the priest said, says that he also passed by on the other side. And we've got to talk about this individual, because this individual was just there to help look at the priest and to help assist the priest in what he was doing. The reason why he would bypass this is because he himself was mad. He himself thought like, well, I don't want to help this guy. No, he understood that most likely the priest that he was assisting had already gone on ahead of him. How dare he show up the priest? And he would be thinking that the priest already observed this individual and he knows that he isn't worthy to be helped. So if my priest did it, I'm not going to dare bring him in. Because if I bring him in, I'm going to get reamed. If the priest left him for dead, I can't bring him anywhere. I have to leave him right there, because otherwise I'll become defiled. Especially if you're looking to do the same thing he's doing. So you can see now why the priest and the priest's assistant walks by this guy. They leave him exactly where he is to die. Does that make more sense to you a little bit? That they see this situation that it's happening. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed on by the other side. And you could kind of hear the whole story, can't you? Could you imagine hearing this in that setting? The highest esteemed religious people in the day are the ones that don't help the people. Like Jesus, I don't know if Jesus was looking to get killed right then and there, but it's a good way of doing it. And here he is, telling this story, and I would imagine that this guy, this lawyer in religious law is still standing, opposing him, and Jesus is telling this entire story. And can you imagine his face, like scratching his head, like, where is this going? And so to them, they're piecing this together, like the priest walked by, the assistant walks by, like the good people in society. They're the ones that leave him there. And then here's the kicker. In 33, I could just imagine Jesus standing there with this up his sleeve. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion. Now you have to understand, this would have sent them into a tailspin. By actually stating that, no, you guys didn't do anything. It was a Samaritan, a despised Samaritan that every single one of you absolutely hates. He's the one that stopped and had compassion. I could imagine them yelling insults at Jesus. I can imagine the lawyer looking at him going like, "Are you stupid, Jesus? How dare you tell a story? This is blasphemy." But Jesus continues on. It's the Samaritan that came along. Why would this upset them so much? Why would this idea of a despised Samaritan, what was going on with them and the Samaritans? And I just want to help you see this. Jews believe Samaritans to be people of doubtful descent and inadequate theology. They were thought to be descendants of people brought by the Assyrians and other conquerors to colonize the land when they were taken over. They were monotheistic, accepted only the Torah, and argued that the true temple was on Mount Gerizim. And so you look at these things, and that's what they believed. And then there's other books like Sirach, which is 50:25 through 26. It says this, that this is what they say: "Two nations my soul detests." This is them thinking this, that God is saying this. "My soul detests." And the third is not even a people. Those who live in Seir and the Philistines and the foolish people that live in Shechem, which would be talking about the Samaritans. This was everything that Jewish people were brought up on. Even Josephus, the antiquity guy from the Jewish times, and especially after the time of Jesus and a little bit there as well. In the time of Alexander, the great Jews and Samaritans quarreled over whether sacrifices should be sent to the temple and their temple or to the temple that was in Jerusalem. They were fighting over this. Josephus reports that the Samaritans did much mischief to the Jews, and I want you to listen to this. This is why it was so heated, including laying waste to their land and carrying some off as slaves. So you can understand there's this hostility. Oh, it gets better. Josephus also states that Samaritans desecrated the Jerusalem temple by scattering bones in it one night during Passover. They literally took bones and they scattered it all in the temple because they knew that they were coming to celebrate Passover. Now, do you know what that would do to them? It would make them all unclean, meaning they would not be able to celebrate Passover. Are you getting why they were hated so much? They're coming against everything that they're doing. Josephus says this, that about 50 AD, hatred increased between Jews and Samaritans. Galileans at the time of festivals customarily went through Samaritan territory on their way to Jerusalem. Samaritans from the village slew a number of the Jewish people. And they have all this that's happening. And then if you really wanted to know why they're hated, is it is believed that the ascension of Isaiah, in the book Ascension of Isaiah 2:15 through chapters 5, it tells of a Samaritan named Belchira who, it says, mistreated the prophets of God, the Israelites, and they seized the prophet Isaiah, which led to the prophets being executed. And if you understand anything about history, what actually happened, they believe, and you can see this in Hebrews, is that he was sawn in half. It would say sawn asunder. So they took one of the most loved prophets, and it is cast on the Samaritans for killing one of the beloved prophets, and not just them, doing a lot of harm to other prophets. So you can understand why they are hated. And for Jesus to basically say it is a despised Jew that's going to be the hero of this story is like saying that your worst enemy will be the hero of your story. I want you to think about something. Who has hurt you the worst in your life? Remember, we're going to do an exam of the soul, an eye exam of the soul. Who has hurt you the worst? I know. Don't throw eggs at me. This is what Jesus is essentially doing to them. Who has hurt you the worst? Because that's the same way it's looking like here. It's not as comfortable, is it? I don't want to talk about this if I'm honest. It is the despised person that you hate the most that has done misdeed after misdeed to you. He's going to be the hero in this story, and Jesus is telling it to them. Can you imagine the anger? He says, the despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, it was him that felt compassion for him. It says in 34, going over to him, the Samaritan, the one that you hate, he soothed his wounds. This Jewish man that's beaten beyond recognition, he soothes his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. And I think you really have to stop and analyze what the Samaritan's doing. Because normally we all understand that a good story would be the hero being the person that you like. It would be a Jewish man. It would be better if he wanted to get his audience behind him to tell of a Jewish man who helps the Samaritan, but Jesus chooses not to do that, right? It should be the hero being a Jewish man, but that isn't how Jesus tells the story. In fact, Jesus tells him the hero of this story is someone that they despise, a group that is hated. And when you look at this, the Samaritan comes over and he takes care of everything, and he doesn't just take him, he actually takes him to an inn. Now, you have to understand what this means. Do you know what that would mean for this Samaritan individual that Jesus is telling this story about? Is that the Samaritan would pick him up, put him on his horse, and he would go into Jericho to find an inn. Where this was happening was in the wilderness, so he would take care of everything. He would give him of himself. He would give oils and bandages and everything. He would bring him into Jericho. Now, the reason why this is important is because as he would bring him back into Jericho, he would bring him into an area, into a situation that essentially would be putting him in jeopardy, his whole life in jeopardy by bringing him there. He himself would be putting his own livelihood in danger by dropping off. Could you imagine him dropping off a Jew in a Jewish village that has been beaten, everything stripped, and he's a Samaritan? Who do you think they would blame? Him. Do you think he would even be able to make it out of town alive? He wouldn't even get justice. They would just look at the situation and go, of course a Samaritan did it. He's risking his own life to bring this Jew back into a situation. And it is a crazy story. And going over to them, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to the inn where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, why is this important? And the reason why I'm going on is because a lot of times we read this story and we just take it at face value. We have no clue what's actually going on. Because during this time, if he would just drop him off and he still had debts because of how long he was there at the inn, they could put him in jail for the debt that he owed. And so the Samaritan is taking care of all of the debt. He's saying, I will collect everything that this man has. The Samaritan is doing this. He's covering all the Jews' issues. He's covering all of his wounds. And not only that, he's going to take care of his debt that he can't pay. Jesus, this is a crazy story. I think it would have been better for the Samaritan to do the same thing, right? Just leave him there. This is way too much effort for this. The next day, it says that he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. And Jesus stops the story. And can you imagine the hush of the crowd, the anger of the crowd, even the anger of the individual that has challenged Jesus? In 36, Jesus can you imagine just Stops and says, now, which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. How would you feel about the story? You know what the man replies? He says, the one who showed him mercy. Now that little thing seems like, oh, that's a good answer. No, it isn't actually. You know why it's not a good answer? Because he couldn't even bring himself to say the Samaritan. That's why he used the one that showed him mercy. And then he answers the question. This guy, this religious elite, this individual that knows the law, he is an expert in it. He answers this thing, and then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. I bet that guy felt like an idiot. But I want you to see something. What Jesus is trying to show him is where he's at. He is the man that's on the side of the road that thinks that he's so perfect, but life is beating him down. And maybe you're there today too. Daniel, can I have you come and play? Maybe you're there too today. Life has robbed you. It has left you. And boy, there's nothing worse than watching people pass you by that you thought would help you. There's nothing worse than people leaving you for dead. There's nothing worse than people saying awful things about you and leaving you exactly where you are. Especially you come to church and you thought for sure people would pick you up, but they sometimes are the ones that kick you while you're down. What do I do with that, Jesus? You see, Jesus is the Samaritan. He is the one who sees you. He doesn't care about what you're wearing. He doesn't care about the accent. He doesn't care about how much money that you have. He just cares about where you are. Jesus is the individual, the unlikely hero that comes on the scene when everybody else has passed you by, and he can't leave you because his compassion compels him. And he gets involved. I'm thankful for a God that stoops to where I am and picks me up because he can't leave me there. I'm thankful for a God that sees me at a distance and stops. I'm thankful for a Jesus that can't just leave me, because I've had so many people just leave me. I'm thankful for God that cares about my wounds enough to mend and to bandage them and to put oils on them and to help me heal, because he cares about all of me. I'm thankful for a God that just doesn't do the bare minimum, but then picks me up and takes me where I need to go. I'm thankful for a God that doesn't leave the burden of the debt that I have incurred all of my life and leaves it to me to be hauled off and not free. I'm thankful for a God that pays the price of my sins and doesn't leave me broken anymore. I'm thankful for a God that loves me this much that he would spread his arms on a cross and say, "It is finished," to let me know that I can experience eternal healing. That when I breathe my last breath, it's not over. You see, because compassion reaches beyond the requirement of the law. And as I was looking at this, I started thinking about how do we become Jesus to a world that needs Jesus? We all are good at justifying why I can't love that person. Right? I mean, I'm sure that even right now, as I said, that, okay, think about the person that's hurt you the worst. Do you know that Jesus would be saying, I don't even want to say it. So the question isn't, who's your neighbor? Maybe the question that Jesus is really asking, whom should you be neighborly to? Whom do you see that you need to be neighborly to? Whom do you see in life that has been beaten down by this that you could easily bypass because you don't have enough time? We never have enough. But who do you need to see with compassion and stop for? Because if Jesus does it for you, how dare you walk by anybody else that needs it? And I know this is different than what we normally do. But the reason I want you to understand is because when we look at parables, there's something deeper than going on than just looking at it. Jesus is getting to the core of the issue of how dare you think that you can love God and choose who you love as a neighbor. It doesn't work that way. He said that He sent His Son for the entire world. Are there people that hurt you? Absolutely. Should they stop you from loving? No. Because you're called for so much more. Are there times that you have to set boundaries? Absolutely. You should. But don't allow yourself to become so darkened by the pain and the hurt that you stop living, that you stop loving. Because God has given us victory over everything that we face. And I just want you to know, I want you to know that God can forgive anybody if He can forgive you. I'll say it to myself, then Adam, you can forgive anything. I don't like what I see in the mirror right now. How about you? When I look at what's there and what Jesus is saying in this parable, in the eye exam of the soul, I'm squinting so hard to see myself in that light, but it's blurry. This is a wrestling match. Because I've been hurt. How many of you have been hurt? Let's just be honest here today. How many of you have some people that, just like that man, you have a tough time saying the name or even giving them credit? But I don't want to be in a situation to where my life is so bound by what has happened to me that has become my identity. You know what I know about the individual, and it's not in the story, is that once this individual is well, I think he'll look differently at people. He'll look differently at the Samaritan. I pray that we can see differently today. I'm not saying everything just magically makes it easier. I'm saying that sometimes what happens is that you have to try every single day to change. I had this friend of mine that was telling me how they had gone through a pretty nasty divorce, and he said something to me that in my heart I've forgiven, but in my head I remember everything. And I thought about that. I thought, my word, like how true is that? In my heart, like I'll come here today and I say, man, I've forgiven, but then when I go home and I think about it, it's a different reality. Any of you ever been there? I just don't want to make sure I'm just the only one feeling this way. And I told her, I said, you know what? Forgiveness is an everyday decision. You do it every single day. You wake up and you do it, and some days you have to capture that thought because otherwise it'll fester and it'll affect you and it'll poison you. Listen to me, friends. Unforgiveness is one of the things that'll kill you. It'll kill your ability to love people. It'll kill your ability to show compassion to others. You've got to watch unforgiveness infiltrating your ability because, listen to me, really at the heart of the story, what Jesus is trying to say, that if you're asking who your neighbor is to justify why you can't love them, then you're showing that you truly don't love God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, all of your might. Every single aspect of you is not loving God the way that you should. How many of you need some help with that today? Some of you just lying, that's a different story. Both my hands are up. Can we stand? You know, the truth of it is I hate this parable. It's like my least favorite one to preach. And you know why it is? Because of what it represents. It represents an uncomfortable truth. And Jesus' parables are full of uncomfortable truths. But as a believer, we have to look at those truths of what he's saying and apply them to our lives. And here's the moment that we do that. How do we do that? Because listen, if you're going to pick and choose who to be good to, if you're going to pick and choose who deserves the love of God, you're doing it wrong. If you're going to pick and choose who deserves to experience salvation and you're going to withhold them because how bad they've hurt you, even though I get it, even though I hate to say this, we are doing it wrong. You know, there used to be this symbol in worship. It's kind of been lost because we just kind of do it because it's something that we see, but there used to be this aspect of raising our hands that just showed surrender. You remember those days? It was an actual thought. There was thought behind it. It meant something. So when I lift my hands, I'm saying I surrender. And that's what I'm doing right now. God, I surrender my hurt. I surrender my pain. I surrender the things that I don't understand. I surrender the people that I have a tough time forgiving. I even surrender my right to get even. I surrender my right to even have to say anything back. I surrender my right to defend myself. If you're there too, can we just lift our hands and surrender right now? That's a tough decision, isn't it? God, I want to be made in your image, and I don't want anything to stop me from that today. And here's the thing, I know for some of you, this is a tough one, and I'm not forcing anybody into it. I'm just saying God is still working on some of you, but some of you today, you need to do this. You need to surrender what it is that you are wrestling with today, because it's not worth holding on to. God, I surrender those things to you. God, I need your help in those situations, God. I need to be able to help. God, I know that I can't love you and have hate in my heart towards a brother or a sister, God. I need to let those things go, God, because I don't want to be stopped from being able to reach out. I don't want to stop being able to find people in need and bypass them because of my grudge, God. I want to see them where they are and realize that I have been there several times, and how many times have I wished that someone would pick me up, love me enough to stop, God. Help me to see that, but in order to do that, you've got to rid me of the hurts and the pains that so many times stop me because I'm afraid of getting hurt again. God, today, we give it all up. We surrender it to you. Mold our hearts, shape us, and change us so that way we can impact our world for you. Because we are no good bound by the things that have happened to us. God, you have given us victory over everything. When you said it is finished, so was my pain, so was my hurt, so wondering. Today, may we experience that in full today. In the mighty name of Jesus, and everybody said, amen. Guys, I love you. And I know that this is not easy. And I know that it's not going to be this thing to where a magic prayer just cured it all. It's going to be a fight every single day. But it is a fight that is worth it. Because there are souls on the line every single day that need to hear the message of Jesus. I love you guys. Strive and contend with Jesus, okay? Have a great day, guys. I love you.